more classes, well, not two more, but this one and next week next week shall be our last class. And we're planning to wrap up the class next week. So if it takes a little slower to get through some of the questions tonight, that's all right. But I do want to try and get through it. I'm looking forward to kind of wrapping up an overview in Ecclesiastes, just because it's been so weighty, and so there's so much going on. I want to have some time wrapping up. And then we're going to endeavor to get into Job. And I'm planning to do a 12-week survey of Job after this, okay? Job is a hefty book. There's 42 chapters. And personally, I think what would serve this in this class and the rhythm we have best is to keep a kind of survey view of it. But what that will require from people in this class is some homework and some reading. Not that I'm going to grade your homework or anything like that, but to keep up with the class, you're going to have to read large sections between the weeks. So just keep that in mind as it goes ahead. Caleb's starting a new class tonight, I believe, on 1 Peter in the other class. You can get up and leave right now if you want. If you want to go to that class. Go ahead, Les. I meant to say something last week because I do want to be, I'm sure that'll be a great class. So that's in classroom number 1. So whether you join tonight or next week, I'm sure you won't miss, you get better earlier, the earlier the better, I suppose. So I just want you all to be aware of what's going on these Wednesday nights and make the choice that suits you best. Really, it's good all around, right? It's all good. So that's kind of the path ahead. So we got this week and next week and then 12 weeks of Job. After that, we're going to study Song of Songs. So we have a lot ahead of us, and we'll get into Lamentations after that. And then we'll be done with this Poetry and Wisdom class, and we'll get back to the post-exilic history. That's way ahead. I mean, don't even need to think about that. It's far ahead. I'm just letting you all know that's the plan. And this all is on the shoulders of all the Old Testament history that Brent did when he was here. He finished up with the time of the divided kingdoms pre-exile. So we're just finishing up kind of the Old Testament, really, through this. And this is where we're at right now. So all that to say, back on Ecclesiastes, we're looking at the last 2 chapters. They are so interwoven, it's hard to look at 11 without looking at 12. Was anyone able to write like a 2 to 3 sentence summary to kind of summarize the ideas wrapped up in these last 2 chapters? And be willing to share that summary? Or what are the big ideas or themes in these chapters that we ought to be aware of as we engage with this study? Les?
Several scriptures in here that talking about the young and the old, and do certain things when you're young, but you're going to grow old. Yeah. It's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a large chunk of this section. Starting in chapter 11 into chapter 12, that's what really ties these two together. And it's fascinating and not accidental at all. This is how the book ends, right? This whole book's been talking about life and death and the certainty of it. And if we're blessed by God to reach old age, then we're going to face the things that chapter 12 says about it. Good. What else do you see in these chapters? Anything else we need to be aware of as we engage with Ecclesiastes 11 and 12? Kathy?
I think it's about being generous with our time while we're here on this earth.
Yeah.
And life is short.
Yeah.
And we're all going to die sometime. Yeah. At any point. And we need to make the best of our time while we're here.
Amen. That's so well put. I have nothing to add to that. I love the way you put that. That is the heart of this. And, it echoes what is said in Ephesians 5 about walking in wisdom. But it also reminds me of Psalm 90. The psalm was attributed to Moses, where he says, "Teach us, Lord, to number our days that we may acquire a heart of wisdom." That's Psalm 90, verse 12. That we may present to you a heart of wisdom. This is a difficult thing to wrestle with. Numbering our days, it takes looking at chapters of the Bible like Ecclesiastes 12 or thinking things like Ecclesiastes 12 talks about and seeing in detail what growing old looks like and might feel like. And it's not always pretty or appealing to us. But to appreciate what we have now and to live for now and take the advantages of what we have now to use it to its best, we have to keep those things in our minds, or else we'll think I'm always going to be young and invulnerable and perfect health and all this. And that's just not the case. Good. All that in mind, let's move forward, because let's start here with the first 6 verses. Can I get a volunteer to read Ecclesiastes 11, verses 1 through 6 for us? Rick, go ahead. Ecclesiastes 1 through 6. 11, 1 through 6, please.
Cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a serving to 7, and also to 8, for you do not know what evil will be on the earth. If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth, and if a tree falls to the south or the north, in the place where the tree falls, there it shall lie. He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. As you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb, or her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything. In the morning sow your seed, and in the evening do not withhold your hand, for you do not know which will prosper, either this or that, or whether both alike will be good.
Awesome. Thank you, Rick. As we started chapter 11, I wanted to kind of keep chapters 9 and 10, or kind of the second half of chapter 9 into chapter 10 in our minds. How do these verses, do you remember any of these discussions you've had over the past 2 or 3 weeks? How does these ideas here in verses 1 through 6 fit with the brevity of life talked about in 9, 11, and the verses following, and the encouragement to be sensible in chapter 10? And even if you don't remember all those, just those two kind of summarizings of the main ideas, like do you see those ideas in these verses of Ecclesiastes 11, 1 through 6? Go ahead, Vern.
I put that we can't control everything life throws at us, but we can control how we respond to life.
Yeah, that's so well put. And that is like, that's such a good answer to this question, because it's a great answer to what Ecclesiastes is saying. The whole book of Ecclesiastes is saying this. You know, you're looking at life, and there's mostly 90% of it you can't control. 10%, you have this 10% to control, and even that, it's kind of iffy, you know? And so this idea of chapter 10 talks about this idea of being sensible, and we'll see some of these ideas come to find their conclusion in these 6 verses. Good. Lark?
Oh, no, it's just, I'm responsible for control.
Yes, I have my own choices to make, right? And Ecclesiastes is constantly reminding us of that, while also constantly reminding us that there's so many things that are going to happen to us, whether or not we like it. The seasons of life in chapter 3, and as one example. Good. Anything else about this that you had in mind? Any other thoughts from chapters 9 and 10 that kind of you see here in verses 1 through 6? I think it's really interesting to think about, like in Ecclesiastes 9, where he says, the race isn't always to the strong, or the race isn't always to the swift, or the battle to the strong, but time and chance overtake us all. Or in chapter 10, these ideas were about, like, you know, quarrying stones or sharpening an axe before you cut some wood. Who would have thought, you know? But there's so much work to do. There's so many things to be done. And you frankly just do not know if tomorrow will come. You don't know. Even if you're the strongest, healthiest, you just don't know. And you don't know if the work you're doing is even going to succeed like you hope it will. And these verses in verses 1 through 6, do you see those ideas here in these first 6 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 11? You know, there's so many reasons to observe the wind. Oh man, what if the wind changes this direction, and maybe, you know, or the tree falls this way? You know, it's like we still have proverbs about this in the 21st century America. It's interesting that we still have these ideas. But the conclusion we're going to see here in a second is we better just get to work, right? We better take control of what we have to control and really get to it. So I played my hand a little bit, or played the hand of this conclusion. What is a conclusion for us in verses 4 through 6? And how do these ideas of the Spirit, or Rick's translation said wind, which is the same word in the Hebrew and in the Greek. Ruach in the Hebrew means both wind and spirit, just like pneuma in the Greek means both wind and spirit. But how do these ideas of the Spirit and the baby in the womb help relay these ideas? So what's the conclusion, first of all, in verses 4 through 6? Do you see it? Pardon? Yeah, there's a creation and a control aspect to it, right? That God's in control and he makes it good, so there's that. And with the woman and the wind, what also do those things have in common? The baby in the womb and the wind. How much can we see those things? Especially then, they're invisible, right? We have ultrasounds now, but even still, it's like, they're like, your baby's probably going to weigh 8 pounds. We may be off by 2 pounds. It's like, well, when it's 8 pounds, that's a significant variance. It's like, who cares if it's within 2 pounds? Might as well not tell me anything, you know? And oh, look, that has your nose. Like, what do you see? You can't see it, So it's like these ideas are still true, even with all our technology, that we don't know the way the spirit comes to the bones. We don't know how life is created, really. That's really what that's talking about. And we don't see the wind or even know how it all, even though we have meteorological ideas, we still don't fully understand it all or see it all. And so similarly is the work of God in this world, right? It's just, there are things we just can't, they'll always be beyond our comprehension. Les?
Of course, at the time that this was written and so forth, they didn't have ultrasound. They didn't have those kinds of things. They didn't have meteorologists telling you the wind's coming from this way or that way or whatever. It's to make you think, or at least appreciate, that God is in control.
Yeah.
And you don't need to worry about how a baby is formed or where the wind is going or coming from and so forth.
Yeah. Yeah. The reason I brought those things up is because it's interesting we still don't, as knowledgeable as we are, we still don't have great conclusions about those things. I think that's fascinating. Kathy?
I like how it points out, though, that a baby is born with a spirit.
Yeah.
We are all born with a spirit, and that scripture says that right now.
Yeah, it does. It's not the main point, but it is looking at that, right? It's a part of this idea. And so, interestingly, it's a wordplay in verse 5 and verse 4, right? He who observes the wind will not sow, and you do not know the way that the wind comes to the bones, or the spirit comes. It's the same word. And so he's kind of making word plays here too. So you do not know the work of God who makes everything. You can start to see as the preacher ends his sermon, you might say, as the preacher Koheleth ends the book, he's really becoming more and more obvious about his faith and his view of the world. But what's his conclusion in verse 6 specifically? And verse 4 and verse 6 really tie together, right? He who observes the wind will not sow, and he who regards the clouds will not reap. In verse 6, what do you do in the morning? You sow, yeah, you get to work, Monty, you get busy. And in the evening, what do? You don't quit. When everyone else quits, you don't quit. Because what's true? You don't know what's going to work. Have you ever worked on something where you thought, this is hopeless, 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 and you do the same thing for the 13th time. It's like, oh, it worked this time. You're like, what did I do differently? You're like, I couldn't even tell you what I did differently. For some reason, things just clicked this time. Maybe I did this tiny difference, or maybe but there's just things like this where like you think it's never, ever going to work. Like brainstorming with somebody, all of a sudden like you're just beating your heads against the wall, and all of a sudden a lightning bolt comes down. You're like, oh, this is what we have to do, right? This is, I think, what this is talking about. But if you don't go through the process of hopelessly slogging through the mire and beating your head against a brick wall, you'll never come to the conclusion. And so a part of this is sometimes it gets really easy to get downtrodden or discouraged, but the idea is to keep at it nonetheless. Cass?
I actually have a question rather than a comment. When it talks about the morning and the evening, and we should continue working through both of those, is it actually talking about a literal morning and a literal evening, or the beginning and the end of life?
That's a good question. What do you guys think? What are the thoughts of the class? Lark says both. Rick?
I think either and or.
Yeah, both. Yeah.
It's all out of your control.
Yeah.
No matter whether it's evening or morning or night.
Yeah.
Evening to late, 24, 30, 10,
Yeah.
8, 6. It doesn't matter.
I
God
gotcha.
God is in control. He made it all. He put the laws of nature in the force.
Yeah.
We can't do nothing about it.
Yeah.
Other than pray. Keep on.
Yeah. So I think there's a really great question, Cass, and I think the point is it is a forceful kind of rhetorical point that you just work as much as you can. And it's not saying you literally have to work 24/7, 365, but I think it is saying as much as you can, you get to work. Because the opposite really isn't going to suit you. One of the big question of Ecclesiastes isn't whether or not we can find happiness. There are things that will bring us joy, enjoying life with the wife of your youth and in your vain life and your vain days. There's things that will bring us joy. But the question of Ecclesiastes is really that of satisfaction. And work is one of the things that really itself, not even the finish of work, but really the process of work is one of the only things that will kind of, I think, in the preacher's mind, engage us in satisfying processes. Not even bring it to completion, right, Cass?
Okay, now I have a comment. I have a best friend in New Zealand named Lou, and she wants to start a garden of her own, and she constantly brings it back to theological things in that before there was sin, there was work.
Yeah.
Before there was sin, there was a garden,
Yeah.
and we were designed to work in the garden and take care of the animals.
Yeah. And if you look at the beginning of this book, right, what did the preacher do? in the first chapters 1 and 2, what did he pursue? He made gardens, he got everything. He did more than that. He pursued the beautiful kingdom. He had like a zoo going on, a whole menagerie of creatures. He had pools and structures, all of this type of work. And it's satisfying and it's beautiful. And as he says in the chapter 2, it brought him some happiness. But it still, he realized it wasn't going to satisfy him. And so it's interesting with all these ideas going on. He even says this in chapter 11, cast your bread upon the waters, for you will find it after many days. Give a portion to 7 or to 8, for you do not know what disaster may happen on the earth. All these ideas are very, to me, like very direct, proverbial kind of thoughts, wise kind of thoughts. Diversify might be how a financial advisor would say today, right? Diversify your assets. You don't want everything kind of siloed in one idea. But even this even has, I think, aspects about giving or about all sorts of things that we ought to find as many ways and as many avenues to invest our time, like you pointed out, Kathy, in our energies, in our resources, the gifts we give, whatever you may think about this, and we have to get to it in verses 4 through 6. There's a lot of waters to cast bread upon, and it's not going to cast itself, right? Like this, the idea of these verses is like there is so many opportunities, and so often things that could stop us are just me, not anything else. People might hem and haw and say, well, this happened, you don't know my story, Ben, but at the end of the day, a lot of times, if I'm being honest with myself, none of those excuses are valid. It was just me kind of getting tired or lazy or fed up or annoyed or whatever. And that's what I think what the preacher's telling us. Like, get to work. There's a lot to do. So I saw a lot of hands. Any final thoughts, comments, questions about this? Lark and then Terry.
Someone made a comment earlier about we know so much more now. And that made me go to the thought that every generation thinks they know so much more. Mm-hmm. And every generation, if they look at God, they're confounded by his wisdom.
Yeah.
So that,
Amen.
I really appreciated that comment.
Yeah, amen. Amen, well said. Terry?
The thing that keeps coming back to me is we're told to keep going, to keep sowing, to keep reaping, because we don't know how it's going to end up. Mm-hmm. Even when we see the wind and we think for sure we know which way the tree's going to fall, we could be wrong. Yeah. So it's not that we're going to do it 15 times and on the 16th time get it right. It's that there could be a different conclusion because of God's control, not our control.
And that's what I was trying to imply about it. Is like there's examples of it. It's just like there's sometimes where you can't even understand what was different about it, but you still had to put your shoulder to the plow nonetheless, right? And I think I'm going to step outside of Ecclesiastes and make a sermonic point, like a preacher point, okay? So bear with me. But in personal work and in sharing the gospel and in influence and in the ways we find ourselves on mission with the gospel, I think I know these verses have incredible application for us. Where sometimes it'd be so easy, like Galatians says, to grow weary in doing good or doing well. And the truth is, there is mostly an element of God's Spirit and God's hand, like he says, even the Spirit, the wind, these things blowing, the things changing, circumstances in people's lives that we just don't know when to stop pushing or to start pushing. And I think part of the wisdom here with people around us as Christians is not to be holding a finger to the wind, like sprinkling grass to see what's going on, to kind of read the tea leaves about when and how and the best methods to share the gospel. But Ecclesiastes 11, 1 through 6, would be the message would be, share the gospel with all 7 or 8, make many divisions to as many people as you can, and work for as long as you can at it. Because truly, Christian, we don't know to whom it will resonate and how and which words will be best for which person. I mean, come on, that's impossible. If you really think about that, it's foolishness to engage in that. And I think it's beautiful that the way this wisdom applies to the spiritual resources and time. I think, Kathy, your summary kind of allowed for this conclusion. I don't know if it was in your mind when you made it, but I think it does. Like, this is a beautiful, to me, kind of spiritual Christian conclusion from this wisdom that wasn't even directly talking about that. So I'm going to go back to Ecclesiastes, but that's one thing I wanted to make sure we heard, because so many times I hear Christians get discouraged or ask, like, I need to find the right way to share the gospel, and it's really never been about that. It's been about sharing the good news and sharing ourselves, being hospitable and just making every effort, being diligent in it, day and night, in season and out of season, right? As Paul said to Timothy. And that's just it. There's no replacement for hard work. That's a depressing answer maybe, or not depressing, but it's just true. It's just blatantly true with this. So Good. Let's keep going. I know there's probably a lot to say here, but I want to keep pushing along. Can I get a volunteer to read Ecclesiastes? This is a long, can I get a couple volunteers actually? Someone read Ecclesiastes 11, 7 through the end of the chapter, those 4 verses. Les, Ecclesiastes 11, 7 through 10. And someone read Ecclesiastes 12, verses 1 through 8. Dave? All right. Dave's champagne right here in the blue, Greg. So Les, 11, 7 to the end of the chapter, and then Dave, verses 1 through 8 of chapter 12, please. Whenever you're ready, Les.
Remember your creator while young. Light is sweet, and it pleases the eye to see the sun.
Les, can I stop
However,
you?
many years...
Les, can you start in chapter 11, verse 7, please? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Chapter 11, verse 7?
Yeah, chapter 11, verse 7 through the end of the chapter, and then Dave's going to read
That's
chapter
what
12,
it
verse
was.
1.
I just had a title there.
Sure. Oh, sorry. I thought that it sounded like you were reading the verse to me. Sorry.
No.
That was my bad. Go ahead.
I'll skip it, okay.
No worries.
Light is sweet, and it pleases the eye to see the sun. However, many years a man may live, let him enjoy them all, but let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything to come is meaningless. Be happy, young man, while you are young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see, but know that for all these things God will bring you to judgment. So then, banish anxiety from your heart and cast off the troubles of your body, for youth and vigor are meaningless.
Awesome. Thank you, Les. Sorry about the confusion.
You ready?
Yep, 12:1, please.
Remember also your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days come and the years draw near, of which you will say, I have no pleasure in them. Before the sun and the light and the moon and the stars are darkened and the clouds return after the rain, in the day when the keepers of the house tremble, and the strong men are bent and the grinders cease because they are few, and those who look through the windows are dimmed, and the doors on the street are shut. When the sound of the grinding is low, and one rises up at the sound of a bird, and all the daughters of song are brought low. They are afraid also of what is high, and terrors are in the way. The almond tree blossoms, the grasshopper drags itself along, and desire fails, because man is going to his eternal home, and the mourners go about the streets. Before the silver cord is snapped, or the golden bowl is broken, or the pitcher is shattered at the fountain, or the wheel broken at the cistern. And the dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher, all is vanity.
Thank you, guys. This is one of the darkest, maybe not darkest, but it's also one of the most beautiful sections of poetry in this book to me. Descriptive, full of metaphor and all this, just beautiful. But it is something we may not like to focus on all the time. But before we even get to the poem in chapter 12, why does the preacher remind us of the days of darkness while encouraging us to rejoice? Right? In verse, light is sweet in verse 7, pleasant for the eyes to see the sun. If a person lives many years, let him rejoice in them all in verse 8. But let him remember that the days of darkness will be many. All that comes is vanity. All right, which is it, dude? Rejoice, but hey, it's actually a lot of darkness ahead of you, so good luck. Get to it. Get to being happy, right? Vern?
I think that the days of darkness, like in any part of life, it can prepare us for life in the future and help us get through it, maybe with some peace and humility.
Yeah.
Because we've learned from it.
Yeah.
And it's just going to keep happening. So.
Yeah, there's a certain amount where you don't even know what joy is until you've reached some low depths even, right? Maybe to your point, you don't know how great a sunny day is until it's been 9 months of cloudy drizzle, right? Not speaking from experience. No, but yeah, I think there is and I like those qualities, peace and humility, that can come if you consider them correctly, right? Because all of us are going to see dark days. And some of us will, by wisdom, use them to have a better perspective. And even if we do, we won't do that perfectly, but some will just grow bitter by those. And I don't think that's his goal. His goal is expressly the opposite, right? Good, what else? What else do you think? Why does he tell us? He's encouraging us to find joy, to share it, to be happy, to rejoice. Why else do you think he bring up these days of darkness? Is that helpful to us as we consider rejoicing now? Yes. Yes. Why? What do you think?
When grief hits you, you lose someone, and you have to go through this, I'm going to say it, rotten life
Yeah.
alone. And if you wallow, if you dwell on the grief, it'll put you in a spot where you can't dig it out. You can't get out. But if you look at God's plan and stick with it the best you can, even when that darkness hits you, you can keep trudging.
Yeah. Yeah, and the rejoicing you did will help you through those times. You can hold it precious, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Yeah, so I don't think he's saying, wait for the other shoe to drop. It's going to happen. But rather, it's more of a saying, listen, like, we all know this, and we just need to think about this. And it goes, Ecclesiastes 7:14 said something very similar. In the days of prosperity, what do? We rejoice. In the days of adversity, what do? We consider. And on both, kind of all these thoughts together paint this picture where the preacher's saying, hey, I'm not going to sugarcoat any of this for you. We all know life is going to be really tough. It may not be tough right now. Maybe it is tough right now. But we all know this. And so, but the encouragement is, the preacher would say, you can still rejoice. And there's some people who hear them be like, you don't know my life. And he'd say, I know my life. Like, I've seen it. I know a lot of lives. And if this really is Solomon, then the man with all the wisdom in the world will say, believe me, I know better than you might think I would. And there's a lot in this where if we've seen a lot of dark times or a lot of difficulties, sometimes we need to hear that there is a possibility that we can still find joy and rejoice in it. And rejoice in every year of life we have. Every single year. Go ahead. What's your name?
My name's Brandon.
Brandon. Okay.
I think it also kind of speaks to this idea of kind of toxic positivity.
Sure.
As Christians, we can kind of get the idea that nothing can ever be bad. And it focuses on the years, rejoice in the years of your life, but remember the days of darkness.
Yeah.
So this proportion of good to bad or light to dark is going to far favor the good as a Christian, because we have that eternal mindset for what ultimately is good. Mm-hmm. But to not acknowledge at all the difficulty and hardship of a broken world full of sin and like all this pain, it's just blindness.
Yeah. That's well put. Yeah, I appreciate that. Les, and then we can maybe move on.
This section talks about living life to the fullest, of course, but as the preacher has said many, many times in Ecclesiastes, but remember, there is going to be judgment, and God's really in control.
Yeah. That's a perfect segue to the next question. How do we apply this advice? Because part of the advice starting here is, again, rejoice in your youth, and let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. So let's start there. How do we apply this advice? Is this advice applied to everyone in this room? Who's it targeted at? The youth, right? The days of your youth. So are there some people in this audience that shouldn't apply this advice? I'm not going to make parameters for this. But there's something here for us. Proverbs talks about this too. There's a truth. You're as young as you'll ever be right now. And so I think there's a beauty, and I don't know if this really is a point. This is truer the younger you are, and the younger you can get this, the better, the more helpful it will be. But nonetheless, none of us should read this and say, well, I'm not young anymore, Ben, so I'm not going to even pay attention to this. I always thought this verse was ironic because by the time I really understood it and embraced it, I already felt old. And I think there's a process in where when you take wisdom like this, you start to feel older when you enjoy wisdom. So it's like this verse always felt like one of those wood blocks some Uncle Mike likes where they're stuck together. You don't know how to get them apart. I'm like, if I understand one part, I can't understand the other part, But here's the beauty of it. For everyone in this room, you're as young as you'll ever be. And so if you're caught up in this mindset where life's been so hard to you that you can't enjoy it anymore, then you're just wrong, is what the preacher would say. And you need to get rid of that stinking thinking and get to the business of finding the things to take joy in. And if you look to the New Testament, there is so much to say about this. The book of Philippians is a great place to start. But nonetheless, even in Ecclesiastes, it's enough. He's saying, listen, none of these things you're pursuing, none of these mindsets you're enjoying or not enjoying or engaging in, just find the joy in your life and engage with it. And rejoicing means sharing it and appreciating it and speaking it. Those are all important aspects of this. I'm answering my own question, right? But how else do we apply this advice? Does anybody know what Jeremiah 17:9 says? I think I heard someone starting to reference it. What does it say? Yeah, the heart's deceitful above all things, desperately sick. Who can understand it? There's also Proverbs, there's a way that seems right into a man, but what's the end of that way? The way is the end of death. I had those two verses reiterated to me as a child growing up all the time. I don't know if you guys remember that in Monroe, but I feel like that was said to us all the time. Don't trust your heart. You're wrong. Your heart's wrong. It won't lead you to bad places. Evil companionship, too. Let's not forget that one as a part of that. Everything you think is fun is not. It will not go well for you. This is how we hear these preaching so often, right? So, but how do we read Ecclesiastes 11 in that? Because so much of the time we preach to our kids, hey, never do anything fun, kind of, is our Christian teaching sometimes, right? I mean, that's kind of how it sounds. How do we engage with this balance? Is this verse counter to that verse in Jeremiah 17? Because he says, what does he say? Remove vexation from your heart. Verse 12, But no, verse 11 again. Verse 9, sorry. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Well, my desperately sick heart, my heart that doesn't know what's right and left, up and down, that's the heart that's going to cheer me. How do we put these verses together? Maybe I'm biased. I just think this is really important to ferret out. And to be able to teach our kids, too, by the way, or our grandkids. How do we combine the wisdom of Jeremiah and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes on this topic? Vern?
I was just thinking in all these verses and the admonitions and everything, we just have to remember that, we need to enjoy life, but we just have to remember that we're going to receive judgment for all of our deeds, no matter what. So just keep that in mind. Enjoy life, but don't go crazy, and don't grow old and crotchety. Enjoy your life.
Yeah.
Just remember that what you do is going to be judged.
Yeah.
So you got to be a light.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that starts us off on the right path, right? Where life is meant to be enjoyed from our Creator. God says that. The wisdom says that. Whatever perspective of life kind of direction you look at says that. There's grand warnings about how dangerous pursuing your pursuits might lead you. But it's meant to be enjoyed, and it's also meant to be used for good, right? And this is the tension that we live our lives between, right? Well, I'm meant to enjoy life, but I'm also meant to be useful and helpful and a servant to all. Those two ideas don't always go in the same direction, right? So, but how do we put these things together? I mean, how do we teach our kids? And maybe genuinely, me as a new parent, how do I teach my daughter this? How do I tell her, hey, enjoy your life, but also be real careful? Cass?
I think it comes back to Kathy's point in the very beginning, which is that our time is limited.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to always keep in mind, whether we're in dark days or good days, rejoicing or weeping, our time is limited, whatever we do. And whatever the days are like, they're coming to an end sometime.
Yeah.
And we don't know when.
Yeah.
And we can't control when. And so how I think you might want to teach your daughter is to have her keep in mind that whatever she chooses to do or chooses to respond to her circumstances, her time is limited.
Yeah.
And you have to strike a balance.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's good. The balance is good, and it's tough, right? These are tough things to teach. Rick and then Judy.
So from Genesis to Revelation, just like your parents taught you, you'll teach little June. God's word is the most important thing. Yeah, you're going to slip up, you're going to foul up, you're going to do this, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. But you teach them, and they didn't do so bad. Here you are. So you'll repeat that. Life is one of those things that we go through, and if you go through it without God, I remember a period in my life until I met Hilda. It was like, woo, Ricky, oh my.
Yeah.
And God's patience and his love and encouragement of people, all those things you'll come across, and he'll bring people into your life that'll remind you that God's way is the only way. And don't forget it, no matter what happens, no matter what you do, no matter where you go, whether it's Texas or Oklahoma, wherever you go, you got to keep God's plan in mind. And if you fail to teach and even when you teach them and things go sideways with them, you got to have the attributes that God has.
Yeah.
Long suffering, patience. And you pray for them, you love them. Something goes haywire. You pray for them and you love them. And if something goes haywire, you pray for them and you love them. And that is from Genesis to Revelation.
Sure. Yeah.
God is consistent.
Yeah.
And his word is, and his people should be.
Yeah.
And they are for the most part.
Yeah.
We're not perfect, but I'll take any of these folks here up against anybody in the world.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I think that, yeah. I don't even think to add that. I think that's a lot. That's great. Judy, what did you have to say? Sorry, Greg, right over here.
Well, God gave us the Spirit, and the Spirit that we got from him, we got to enjoy this place and this world that he had given us. And through our foolishness, we needed Jesus to save us from our foolishness. And fortunately, we figured it out, and we became Christians. And we figured out how to serve and worship God. And we try to do the right things and try to serve others and help others. And hopefully in the end, we'll find that place, home in heaven, because God wants that Spirit back.
Yeah. I think there's a difficulty in the middle of all this. This is, like I said, this is one of those maybe paradoxes or tensions of the Bible's teaching. Here's where I'm at with all this, for what it's worth. I think we have to be real careful, even with verses like Jeremiah 17:9. We shouldn't avoid them, and we shouldn't not say them. We should say them. We should talk about them. But we have to be real careful sometimes in teaching morals and principles that we don't lead it to fear-mongering, where it's not this thing where it's like, okay, if you don't follow your heart ever, it's like you're wrong. It's like there's ways to say this where we have to understand that there is also that God's given us our hearts and that the life is meant to be enjoyed. And sometimes with the burdens we place upon people, or sometimes the burdens we place upon our kids, and I'm not talking about my parents, I'm just talking about society and culture and life, that this is an easy way to go. I mean, what's God's advice for fathers in Ephesians? Don't provoke. This is the one thing God says to fathers in the New Testament, basically. One thing. Don't provoke them to wrath. We better think about that, right? We better think about how prone we are to doing things poorly and engage with ideas like this where we can be really easy to be like, hey kid, you're wrong all the time. Your heart's sick and deceitful and you're not going to do the right. So you better, whatever the case is. We have to also remember wisdom like this, where from the preacher from his heart to someone else's heart says, your life's meant to be enjoyed. Don't forget that either. And I think sometimes Christians can be bad at teaching our kids this idea, where we expect them to act the right way and to be the right way and to present the right way to such a degree where we never remind them that serving God is a joyful thing. And we never remind them that you can think about the judgment of the Lord and also think about having a joyful life in the same sentence, in the same breath. And how many times have we heard ideas like this or taught ideas like this to our kids or heard them in sermons or our classes where we say both? And maybe you say all the time, and I hope that's true. But I'm just saying, when we look at wisdom like this and we compare it with other parts that are also warning against the bad sides of things, we have to be able, like Psalm 119 says, to put the sum of God's word together. And these ideas that are purposefully in tension, God gave us both of them because they both are true. And we have to be able to navigate both of them to be successfully wise people, parents, grandparents, mentors, whatever the case, teachers. And maybe this is just a personal, soapbox of mine. If it is, I apologize. I've just seen this a lot. And I think we have to be real mindful that we need to teach young people to enjoy faith. And first of all, it means we have to enjoy our faith. And if we're just serving God ho-hum, automaton, because I have to do what's right and I hate it, what are our kids going to learn about the gospel? That it's boring and hard and difficult and sad and just awful, but we have to do it or else we'll go to hell. Which, there's a truth to that. There are hard aspects, there are boring aspects maybe, and there are difficult, but the overarching, we have to. It's a mission of ours. We have to find the joy in the Lord. We have to share it and exist in it and it has to be the overriding truth of our lives, or else our kids won't know where to go. And that's what I think this wisdom is talking about. Rejoice, young man, in the days of your youth. Let your heart cheer you in the days of your youth. Walk in the ways of your heart, in the sight of your eyes, but know that for all these things, God will bring you to judgment. What a perfectly concise and balanced verse to give our young people. But we have to understand what both sides of it mean, or else they're hopeless. So thank you for enduring my little sermon about this. I think this is really important that we think about critically. So we'll finish up with the stuff about growing old, and then we'll finish up next week with these last questions about the preacher and all this idea about being wise and fearing God and keeping his commandments. I really appreciate all your comments. I really enjoyed the discussion. I love you all, and that's all for class.